On tonight, I'd like for you to reflect on this day being the birthday of a very famous person in history. So much can be said about Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, but I want to reflect on this day not just because it's her birthday, having been born on this day in 1917, but I'd like for you to understand a little bit about her in appreciation of where we are today and why it is important to vote. I will not make any recommendations about who to vote for or which party to vote for. I would only emphasize the importance of us exercising our citizenship privilege and right to vote. I am aware of many people who are completely disengaged from the voting process. They say my vote does not count. I don't get involved in politics. I'm too busy. One person can't make a difference. The system is corrupt, so I don't participate in it. Or God will put in office who he wants in office. Some have argued, even within the church, that God does not want us voting. I would beg to differ, given at least two passages of Scripture. Number one, Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. In essence, that passage teaches us to be subject to our government official and respect laws and government. I would hardly doubt that God would not want us to participate in the voting process if he then tells us to be subjected to our government. Then we read in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, that God expects for us to pray for our government, where in the King James he says, pray for kings and all in authority. Not only does God teach us to be subject to civil law and to government, but he teaches us to pray for them. So it would stand to reason that participating in the voting process would be consistent with God's expectations for those who are to be subject to and pray for their government. As it relates to Fannie Lou Hamer, she is a famous person in regards to voting rights. Unfortunately, perhaps because we live in a male-dominated society, much history and fanfare has been given to men who have done much to advance the cause of civil rights. But we must not overlook women such as Fannie Lou Hamer. She was a social activist, helping to promote voting rights and women's rights. She was a community organizer and a respected civil rights leader. There are some things that we need to understand about her as we consider the importance of voting. But given her background, we must learn to appreciate what she went through in order to help us to get to where we are. She was born in the state of Mississippi. She was afflicted with polio as a child, and even at the age of 13, with polio, she was known to pick 200 to 300 pounds of cotton per day. If you've never picked cotton, or chopped cotton as they say, that is certainly a monumental accomplishment. She spoke at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. There, she spoke about an experience the year before in Winona, Mississippi, where as a result of trying to register to vote and help register others to vote, she was falsely arrested. She was placed in a jail cell, and police officers in the jail gave a blackjack to the inmates and allowed them to beat her. She suffered permanent injuries as a result. The damage, both physically and emotionally, could not be undone. What is also interesting about her is that she is the victim of something seldom spoken of in American history. As people proudly talk about the Abraham Lincolns and the John F. Kennedys, it is interesting how they ignore some of the darker parts of history. And one of those things is many black women in the 1960s were involuntarily forced to have hysterectomies. This often happened in the case of a person like Fannie Lou Hamer, who went to the hospital for a surgical procedure unrelated to women's health issues. In fact, she had a tumor that had to be removed. And unbeknownst to her, like so many black women of the day, she awoke to find that she had been given a hysterectomy, which was a common practice of the day. Her family's livestock had been poisoned. Fannie Lou Hamer was shot at 16 times. When she worked as a sharecropper, she tried to help registered people to vote and was fired from the plantation that she was working on. And yet the owner of the plantation would not allow her husband to leave until after he worked the harvest. Because of the hysterectomy that was previously spoken of, Fannie Lou Hamer and her husband adopted 2 children. One of her children had a medical emergency, and when she and her husband tried to take her to the hospital, they refused to treat her because of Fannie Lou's engagement in trying to help people to vote. This is a monumental story on many fronts, and so much more can be said about Miss Hamer. One thing for sure is that people today do not realize, or perhaps do not give second thought, to all of the sacrifices that have been made in our behalf. Number 2, young people who think they have struggles many times don't know the meaning of struggle. A person who has been subjected to the likes of a Fannie Lou Hamer would certainly have stories to tell and enlighten others about what struggle is really about. But number 3, and more important to the point of this broadcast tonight, is that this was a person who sacrificed tremendously so that we might have the right to vote. Not exercising that right should certainly bring shame to a person who refuses to participate in the process, but then complains about the outcomes. As we consider the importance of voting, from both a biblical standpoint as well as a rational standpoint, it seems that God would have us to vote, seeing as how he wants us to be subject to government officials and to even pray for them. From just a purely rational standpoint, not to suggest that the Bible is irrational, but just from a everyday rational standpoint, voting must be important, considering how hard people fought to keep us from voting and how much suffering and sacrifice and selflessness went into helping to gain that right. What will you do this fall? Will you honor Fannie Lou Hamer and others who participated in the struggle to get us voting rights, or will you sit back and complain? I think it would be a tremendous honor to her and all of those who sacrificed on our behalf to get us these rights if we would exercise that right and use the privilege that we have to vote. See you on Election Day. This has been another edition of A Few Minutes with the Minister. We hope you are inspired to vote.